Throughout human history, people vanish, ships disappear in the oceans, airplanes dissolve into the sky. But villages don't just vanish. They don't simply evaporate overnight, leaving behind no trace and no explanation. Yet in November of 1930, on Lake Anjikuni in the Canadian Arctic, something exactly like that happened. Something that still haunts researchers, skeptics, and dreamers to this day. Joe Lebel, a French-Canadian hunter and trapper, had known this small Inuit village for 12 years. He knew every family, remembered the names of the children, shared hunted game with the local hunters many times, and spent long nights by their fires listening to stories. He knew every sound of that place. Dogs barking at dawn, children laughing between the homes, sled runners creaking over morning snow, women's voices murmuring as they worked hides, the crackling of fires under pots of meat. So when, on that November day, trudging along his usual route through the endless tundra, he saw smoke rising above the village, something inside him warmed. Smoke meant people were home. It meant the hearths were burning, that after a long freezing trek he could count on hot tea, a warm place to sleep, and friendly company. Lebel even smiled, imagining old Angwingwak grumbling in his broken English, asking whether the hunting had been good that season. But as he got closer, the smile slid off his face. Silence. Absolute dead silence, the kind that simply doesn't exist where people live. No barking dogs. And they were always the first to sense someone approaching, always raising a happy racket. No voices, no children shouting. None of that faint hum of life you feel even from afar. Only the wind whistling between the frozen mounds, and the smoke rising from the igloos as if the village were still going about its usual life. Lebel slowed down. Something inside him tightened with a vague, inexplicable unease. Maybe everyone went out hunting? But then why were the fires still burning? Maybe they were all gathered in one big igloo for a meeting? Even then, he should have heard something, anything. He stopped about 50 steps from the first dwelling. Stopped sharply, instinctively, as if he'd run into an invisible wall. His heart began to beat faster, though he couldn't say why. Some deep, primal part of him was screaming that something was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. He held his breath and listened again. Nothing. Just the wind and his own heartbeat in his ears. And then he saw the dogs. 7 huskies lay beside one of the igloos, still tied to their stakes. Dead. Lebel sucked in a breath, and something cold twisted in his gut. Even from a distance he could tell they hadn't frozen. Their bodies had curled up in a way he recognized all too well. It was hunger. They had died of starvation, slowly and painfully, unable to break their ties. A wave of nausea hit him. His hands trembled and he shoved them into his parka pockets, trying to steady them, though he knew the shaking wasn't from the cold. He'd lived among the Inuit long enough to know one unbreakable truth. What he was seeing was impossible. Simply impossible. An Inuit would sooner die himself than leave his dogs tied up to starve. Those animals weren't just helpers. They were survival itself. Leaving them like this went against everything the North teaches, everything these people believe, everything their culture is built on. So something happened. Something sudden. Something terrifying enough that people didn't even have time to free their dogs. Or couldn't. Lebel swallowed, trying to ease the dryness in his throat. The fear was irrational, foolish, even in broad daylight, in a village he knew so well. But it was there. Cold, sticky fear crawling up from his spine. He forced himself to take a step forward. Then another. The snow crunched under his boots unnaturally loudly in the dead silence. Every step felt heavy, like he was wading through thick water. Slowly, as if in a nightmare, Lebel reached the nearest igloo and looked inside. It was warm. That was the first thing he noticed, and it struck him as especially creepy. In the center, the fire still glowed, the embers red and alive, giving off steady warmth. Someone had tended the fire recently, maybe hours ago, maybe even less. Lebel looked around. Everything was in its place. Too much in its place. Against the far wall lay neatly folded sleeping skins. Next to them were women's tools for hideworking, a bone scraper placed with the kind of care someone uses when planning to return in a minute. In the corner stood a Kudlik lamp filled with seal oil. Its wick was burning down, giving a faint glow. On a flat stone near the hearth lay pieces of dried meat. Half-eaten. Half-eaten. The word stuck in Lebel's mind like a splinter. People don't just abandon food. Especially not here, where every piece of meat could mean the difference between life and death in winter. He crouched and touched the meat. It was firm and cold but not frozen, meaning the igloo had been warm not long ago, and the fire had been burning. Whatever happened was sudden, he realized. Sudden enough to make people abandon their food, their warmth, everything, and walk away. Or, a thought shuddered through him. Something took them so quickly they didn't have time to take anything. He stepped out of the igloo, inhaled the cold air deeply to calm his racing heart, and went to the next dwelling. His hands were still trembling, and he no longer pretended it was because of the cold. The second igloo was the same. Glowing embers, belongings undisturbed, a copper pot with frozen stew inside. Labelle recognized the pot, a trade good he himself had brought here 2 years ago. The stew was half-cooked, chunks of meat still large, vegetables still hard. Someone had started making dinner and never finished. In the third dwelling he found children's toys, small figures carved from walrus bone, scattered across the floor as if a child had been playing and suddenly got distracted, or was taken away. Labelle swallowed hard, feeling his throat tighten. He had no children of his own, but he knew this boy, a bright 6-year-old rascal who always begged him for stories about the big cities down south. Fourth, fifth, sixth igloo. Everywhere the same. Warmth, abandoned meals, belongings left where they were. But something else was even stranger. At the entrance of each home stood the rifles. Old Winchesters, shotguns, even a couple of small-caliber seal hunting rifles. All propped neatly against the walls, some even loaded. That unnerved Labelle more than anything else. An Inuit might forget anything but not his gun. Especially not when heading into the tundra. Especially not if he's leaving in a hurry. A gun is protection, food, survival. A gun is the last thing a person of the north leaves behind. Labelle stopped in the middle of the village, slowly turning in place, trying to take in the whole picture. 12 dwellings. All empty. All with glowing fires. All with abandoned food, belongings, weapons. Dead dogs on their leashes. Not a single person. Not a single sign of struggle or violence. Not even a hint of panic. Everything was too neat, too ordinary, as if people had stepped out for a moment and were supposed to come right back. But they hadn't. Labelle tried to steady himself, to think rationally. He was an experienced trapper, had seen a lot in his 40-plus years. There had to be a logical explanation. There had to be. Maybe they heard something? A call for help? A distress signal? Something that made them all rush out at once? But then why hadn't they taken their guns? Why hadn't they freed the dogs? Why hadn't they put out the fires? Maybe it was sickness? Some sudden outbreak, and the people panicked and ran? But Inuit don't panic like that. Their whole culture is built on calmness in the face of danger, on rational survival. And sickness doesn't explain why there were no bodies. Not a single one. An attack? A hostile tribe? But there were no signs of struggle. No blood. And what kind of attackers move so fast that people don't even reach for their weapons? Labelle walked along the frozen lakeshore, searching for tracks. The snow was trampled around the village as usual, footprints going in every direction. Toward the water holes, toward hunting spots, but nothing unusual. Nothing that pointed to a mass departure. Nothing that explained where 30 people had gone. 30 people. 13 men, 9 women, 8 children. Labelle could name them all. Nguingwak, the old hunter with the scar on his cheek. His wife Akaya, who made the best seal soup in the region. Their son Nanak, a teenager who dreamed of going to Churchill one day to see a real train. Little Sedna, a 4-year-old girl who always hid behind her mother's parka when she saw a white man. All of them were gone. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the snow with bloody shades of red. Labelle realized night was coming, the long, merciless Arctic night. Staying here alone, in this dead village, among glowing embers and ghostly silence, was unbearable. But leaving wasn't an option either. He had to call for help, had to inform the authorities. He had to find these people. He searched the village again, this time more carefully, hoping to find something, anything. In one of the igloos he found a trader's journal, a man who visited occasionally. The last entry was dated 2 weeks earlier. Good hunting. People are well. Traded flour for skins. Will return in spring. 2 weeks ago everything was normal. And now it was a ghost village. When darkness finally settled, Labelle lit a large fire in the middle of the settlement, more for courage than for warmth. He sat by the flames, wrapped in his parka, staring at the dark silhouettes of the empty igloos. Sometimes the wind rushed through the open entrances and produced a long, haunting moan, something almost human. And every time Lebel flinched, grabbing his knife. He didn't sleep that night, not for a second. And at dawn, as soon as the first faint light appeared, he gathered his things and fled the village at almost a running pace, not looking back until the snow domes disappeared behind the horizon. He needed to reach the nearest Royal Canadian Mounted Police outpost. He needed to tell someone what he had seen, because if he tried to forget it like a bad dream, the fear he felt in the dead silence of Anjikuni would destroy him. It was nearly 200 kilometers across the tundra to the RCMP post in Churchill. Lebel covered the distance in 4 days, barely stopping to rest, driven by a vague, irrational terror that if he slowed down, something would catch up to him, something from that dead village. Sergeant James McCrae, a Great War veteran with faded blue eyes and graying mustache, didn't believe him at first. It was obvious by the way he looked at Lebel, with the professional skepticism of a policeman who'd heard far too many strange stories from people who'd spent too much time alone in the tundra. "Mr. Lebel," he said in a calm, measured voice, "you're telling me that 30 people simply vanished, all at once, without leaving a single trace?" Lebel sat in the tiny office, clutching a mug of hot coffee, feeling the words clog in his throat. He knew how this sounded. He knew exactly what McCrae was thinking, another trapper who spent too long alone, maybe drank on the way, maybe started hallucinating. "I know how it sounds," Lebel said, his voice trembling despite his effort to control it. "I don't believe it myself, but I was there. I saw the empty homes. I saw the glowing embers. I saw the dead dogs. Sergeant, these people didn't leave voluntarily. They left food. They left weapons. An Inuit never leaves his gun." Something in his voice, the raw, honest desperation, made McCrae straighten up. He had lived in the North long enough to read people well, to tell drunken rambling from real fear. And Joe Lebel was truly terrified. "All right," the sergeant said, setting his pen aside. "I'll gather a team. We leave at dawn." The journey back to Lake Anjikuni took a week. McCrae brought 2 constables, a local Inuit guide named Padlak, and, against his better judgment, allowed Lebel to come along. The weather was brutal. Blizzards gave way to deceptive calm, temperatures dropped to -40, and the wind cut like a knife. Padlak, a quiet man in his 40s with a face creased from a lifetime of squinting into the wind, didn't speak until the 3rd day. "Anjikuni Lake is a bad place," he said in English with a heavy accent, not looking at the others. "My grandmother said tornate live there. Spirits. They take people sometimes." McCrae scoffed quietly but didn't argue. He was a rational man, an officer who believed in evidence and logic, but he had lived among northern peoples long enough to respect their beliefs even when he didn't share them. When they finally reached the village, Lebel felt his insides tighten with recognition. Yes, everything was exactly as he had left it. The snow domes rising from the white plain, the silence, the horrifying, suffocating silence. But one thing was different. The fires were out now. In 2 weeks, the embers had died completely, leaving only cold ash. The village felt even more dead, even more like a grave. McCrae dismounted and slowly looked around. Even his practiced composure cracked when he saw the dead dogs still tied to the stakes, now half buried by drifting snow. "Sweet Mother of God," one of the constables muttered. A young man named Thompson who had never seen anything like this. Padlak dismounted but wouldn't approach the village. He stayed at a distance, and Lebel noticed how tightly he clutched the bone amulet around his neck, a protective charm Inuit wore against evil spirits. For the next 3 days, the group methodically searched every dwelling, every corner of the settlement. McCrae made detailed notes in his notebook, Thompson sketched the layout of each igloo, and the second constable, O'Connor, an experienced tracker, tried to find any clues that could explain what had happened. They found exactly what Lebel had found. Half-eaten food, unfinished stew, children's toys scattered on the floor, women's sewing tools neatly arranged, rifles propped by every entrance, lamps long burned out, everything untouched, everything exactly where it had been. "This doesn't look like an attack," McCrae said on the evening of the 3rd day, as they sat around the fire they'd built in the middle of the village. "There are no signs of struggle, no blood, no damage. If this were a hostile tribe or white hunters, there would have been a massacre. There would be bodies. There would be looting. Maybe they left because of sickness? Thompson suggested. Some kind of epidemic, and they panicked and ran? O'Connor shook his head. I checked the snow around the village for a kilometer in every direction. There are no tracks. There are old ones, trampled down stuff, normal activity around the village. But there are no signs of a mass departure. No trail of a group of people heading off the same way. Nothing. That's impossible, Thompson said. 30 people can't just vanish into thin air. And yet, McCrae replied dryly, that's exactly what happened. LaBelle stayed silent, staring into the fire. He was thinking about little Sedna, the girl who always hid behind her mother's parka. Thinking about Angwingwak, who had promised to teach him how to properly dress a caribou. Thinking about how these people laughed, ate, lived their simple, hard lives. And now they were gone. Just gone, as if they'd never existed at all. On the fourth day, Padlak, who had refused to enter the village until then, reluctantly agreed to inspect the dwellings. McCrae hoped that a local might notice something the white men had missed. Padlak walked from igloo to igloo slowly, tense, as if expecting to see something terrible at any moment. In one of the homes he suddenly stopped, crouched down, and picked up a small amulet from the floor, a carved walrus ivory figure. This is Sedna's, he said quietly. McCrae realized the guide had known the people here. She always wore it, for protection. She would never leave it behind. He straightened up, the amulet clenched in his fist, and looked at McCrae. There was something in his eyes that made a chill run down the sergeant's back. My grandfather told a story, Padlak said slowly, choosing his words. Long ago, when his grandfather was young, a village in the north, beyond the big water. The people disappeared the same way, all at once. The elders said it was the Tornate, spirits who live under the ground, under the ice. Sometimes they take people. I don't know why. They just take them. Padlak? McCrae said wearily. You don't seriously believe that, do you? The guide gave him a long look. Sergeant, I've seen many strange things in the north. I've seen lights in the sky that don't move like the northern lights. I've heard sounds under the ice that no animal can make. My people have lived here for thousands of years. We know there are things a white man doesn't understand. McCrae wanted to argue, but the words stuck in his throat. Because he himself, a rational police officer, a man of law and order, couldn't explain what he'd seen. 30 people couldn't just evaporate. But they had. That night, their last night at Lake Anjikuni, LaBelle didn't sleep. He lay in his sleeping bag, staring at the stars through the open flap of the tent, and thought. Thought about the silence of this place. About the way smoke was still rising from the igloos when he first arrived. About the dead dogs. About the children's toys on the floor. Somewhere far off, the wind began to howl, and in that howl LaBelle imagined he heard voices. Human voices calling, crying. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push the sounds out of his head, but they followed him all night, turning into nightmares that jolted him awake in a cold sweat. In the morning, the team broke camp and headed back to Churchill. McCrae carried detailed notes, sketches, and records with him, but he knew none of it actually explained anything. His report would say, Village at Lake Anjikuni found deserted. Inhabitants missing under unexplained circumstances. No signs of violence. Motive and direction of disappearance unknown. Dry, official words for something that had no logical explanation. The story of Lake Anjikuni spread across the north slowly, like a crack running through ice. At first it was whispered in trading posts. Then it leaked into newspapers in the southern cities, picking up extra details along the way, half of them invented by journalists hungry for a sensation. But the core remained the same. An Inuit village had vanished without a trace. McCrae sent his report to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police headquarters in Ottawa, expecting experts to be dispatched, a large investigation to begin. But it was 1930, the world was sliding into the Great Depression, and the government had bigger problems than some missing Inuit at the edge of the civilized world. The reply was brief. The case was noted, continue monitoring, report any new findings. There were no new findings. LaBelle went back to his routes, to hunting and trading, but something inside him had shifted. He began to avoid Lake Anjikuni, making a 100-kilometer detour just to stay away from that place. At night he was haunted by dreams. He saw empty igloos, heard children's laughter cut off mid-giggle, woke up with the feeling that someone was calling his name from the darkness. He started collecting stories. It became a kind of obsession to find similar cases, to find some kind of explanation for what he'd seen. And it turned out the Arctic held more secrets than he'd ever imagined. In the small Churchill library, in the dusty archives of the Hudson's Bay Company, in endless conversations with old trappers and Inuit elders, LaBelle found fragments of strange tales. Not all of them were about disappearances, but all of them were about how, in the North, normal logic sometimes breaks down. An old trapper named Mackenzie, a Scot with skin like worn leather, told him about a small fishing camp on Victoria Island that was found empty in 1922. 5 families, 23 people. They were found the same way: empty tents, fishing gear in place, food still in the pots. The official version was that they'd left because of poor fishing. But Mackenzie only shook his head. "Bad fishing's no reason to ditch everything," he said, packing his pipe. "Inuit are patient folk. They've lived through leaner years than that. No, something else happened there. I saw that place myself. The silence there. It made your ears ring. Like in a church. No, worse than in a church. Like in a grave." There were other stories too. A team of geologists that vanished near Coronation Gulf in 1926. Their camp was found untouched. Gear all in place, journals neatly stacked. The geologists themselves, 4 experienced men, had simply melted away. The official version was that they'd gone through the ice and drowned. But the bodies were never found. The expedition of missionary Father de la Roche, lost somewhere between Yellowknife and Great Slave Lake in 1928. 6 people, including 2 native guides. Only their sleds were found overturned, but not broken. No bear tracks, no signs of a fight, just empty tundra and abandoned sleds. LaBelle wrote down all these stories in a thick notebook he carried everywhere. He wasn't a scientist or a researcher, but he felt there had to be some pattern, some connection between all these cases. One winter evening in 1931, in a Churchill tavern, he struck up a conversation with an old Inuit man named Kakertok. The elder was very old. Wrinkles cut across his face like cracks in ancient ice, and his eyes were cloudy with the start of cataracts, but his mind was sharp. "You want to know about disappearances?" Kakertok asked, sipping hot tea laced with rum. "I'll tell you what the elders know. What the white man doesn't want to hear." LaBelle leaned closer, feeling his heartbeat quicken. "The North is not your land." Kakertok began slowly, as if tasting each word. "The North has been ours for thousands of years. But even we know we're only guests here. The true owners are different. We call them tornate spirits. They live under the ground, under the ice, in places where the sun's light never reaches." The old man fell silent, staring into the fireplace. The flames flickered in his cloudy eyes, giving them a strange, otherworldly shine. "Usually they don't touch people," he said at last. "We live our life, they live theirs. But sometimes people go where they shouldn't. Or they do something wrong. Or maybe they're just unlucky. And then the tornate take them." "Take them where?" LaBelle asked, though he already felt the question was foolish. Kakertok shrugged. "No one knows. Underground. To their world. Maybe they eat people. Maybe they make them slaves. Maybe something else. We don't know. We only know one thing. The ones they take never come back." "But that's just..." LaBelle faltered, searching for the right word. "Just legends. Superstition." The old man gave him a long, measured look. "White men always say that. Legends. Superstition. And then a white man disappears, and the other white men stand there scratching their heads, wondering how." He finished his tea and stood up, getting ready to leave. "My grandfather saw this happen 3 times in his life. Villages that went empty. People said they went hunting or fishing or they moved. But my grandfather knew the truth. The tornate came, and when they come, it's better not to ask questions. Better to stay far, far away." LaBelle sat alone in the now empty tavern, staring at his notebook. The rational part of his mind rejected everything Kakertok had said. Spirits living underground? Absurd. Superstition from people who didn't understand science or the laws of nature. But the other part, the part that had stood in the dead silence of Lake Anjikuni, the part that had seen the dead dogs and half-eaten food, the part that had felt that irrational animal terror, that part wasn't so sure. Because science couldn't explain where 30 people had gone. Science couldn't explain why there were no tracks. Science was just as helpless in the face of this mystery as the ancient Inuit legends. The Arctic of the 1930s was a place where two worlds collided. On one side, modern civilization with its science, technology, rational thinking. Airplanes were starting to cross the tundra. Radio-connected remote outposts. Geologists searched for minerals. Cartographers drew precise maps. On the other side, the ancient world of the North, a world that had existed for thousands of years before the white man arrived. A world with its own laws, its own secrets, its own spirits and legends. A world that wasn't in any hurry to reveal its mysteries. And Lake Anjikuni lay somewhere on the border between these worlds. When McCrae returned to Churchill, he tried to approach the matter scientifically. He contacted a university in Toronto, sent letters to several anthropology and ethnography professors. Most never replied. One professor, a certain Stuart McLean, sent back a polite letter suggesting the village might have been abandoned due to famine, conflict with another band, or religious reasons. Nomadic northern peoples often move in ways that seem unpredictable to us, McLean wrote. What looks to us like a sudden disappearance might simply be an ordinary migration. You may find these people elsewhere if you continue your search. But McCrae had continued searching, and he didn't find them. He questioned guides, trappers, missionaries, anyone who might have seen something. No one had seen a group of 30 Inuit on the move. No one had crossed their trail. Constable O'Connor, the experienced tracker, returned to Lake Anjikuni the next spring when the snow melted. He hoped to find tracks that the winter had hidden. He spent 2 weeks there, methodically combing the land around the village, checking every boulder, every crack in the ice. He found nothing. Or rather, he found exactly what he expected to find, the normal remnants of Inuit village life. Bones from dressed animals, scraps of old clothing, broken tools. All ordinary, all mundane. Nothing that explained the disappearance. O'Connor returned to Churchill quiet and withdrawn. McCrae asked him directly, "What do you think happened to those people?" O'Connor stared out the window for a long time, at the endless tundra stretching beyond the town. "Sergeant," he said at last, "I've been a tracker for 20 years. I've tracked criminals, found missing people, read signs in the land that others never noticed. I've always taken pride in being able to read the ground like a book." He turned to McCrae, and in his eyes there was something like fear. "But the earth around Anjikuni is silent. It doesn't tell me anything, and that scares me more than any explanation I could come up with." Years passed. The Anjikuni case slowly turned from a mystery into a legend, and from a legend into a campfire tale, embellished a little more each time it was told. People said strange lights were seen over the lake. People said there was singing coming from underground. People said you could still meet the ghosts of the vanished villagers. How much of it was true and how much was invention, no one knew anymore. The truth had dissolved somewhere between the official reports in forgotten archives and the oral traditions of the Inuit, which white men never took seriously. But one thing was certain. Lake Anjikuni became a place people avoided. Inuit steered clear of it, never camped there, never fished its waters. White trappers and hunters stayed away too, though few admitted it aloud. Because there were places in the north where even the bravest, most rational men felt something primal, something ancient. Places where the earth seemed to hold secrets no human was meant to know. And Lake Anjikuni was one of those places. In 1935, 5 years after the disappearance, a man named Edward Farrell arrived in Churchill. He introduced himself as a journalist from Toronto working on a series of articles about the mysteries of the Canadian North. In reality, Farrell was a writer of cheap pulp adventure novels, looking for material for his next book. He found LaBelle in the same tavern where the trapper now spent most of his time. LaBelle had aged far more than he should have. Gray streaks in his hair, deeper lines on his face, hands that trembled when he wasn't consciously controlling them. He no longer went on long routes, preferring to stay close to civilization, to people, to light. Farrell bought him whiskey and started asking questions. LaBelle didn't want to talk at first, but alcohol and years of silence loosened his tongue. He told everything: the smoke above the igloos, the dead dogs, the silence. Farrell wrote it all down, eyes shining with the excitement of a writer who'd struck gold. "And what do you think happened?" Farrell asked when LaBelle finally went quiet. "What's your own theory?" LaBelle stared at his glass for a long time, as if the answer might rise from the amber depths of the whiskey. "I've thought about it for 5 years," he said slowly. "Every night I've thought about it. I've gone through every possible explanation. You know what's the worst part? None of them work." "What do you mean? An attack?" But there was no blood, no struggle. And who attacks a village so fast people don't grab their guns? Disease? Then there would have been bodies, or at least signs of panic. Famine? They had food, their stores were full. Internal conflict? 30 people don't kill each other without leaving evidence. Migration? Without taking the dogs, without taking the rifles, without taking supplies. Labelle fell silent, rolling the glass between his hands. Every explanation breaks against the facts. And then there's only one thing left, the thing I don't want to admit. That something happened there. Something I don't understand. Something that doesn't fit my experience or my logic. "You believe in the paranormal?" Farrell leaned forward eagerly. Labelle gave a bitter smile. 5 years ago I would have laughed in your face. I was a practical man. I believed in what I could see, touch, explain. But now I don't know what I believe. Farrell published his article in the spring of 1936. It was full of dramatic details, half of which he invented. He wrote about a cursed lake, spirits of the tundra, a portal to another dimension. The article was a hit among fans of the sensational, and it spawned dozens of imitators. When McCrae read it, he was furious. He wrote an angry letter to the newspaper demanding a retraction. But the editor politely declined. "People want mysteries, Sergeant," the editor wrote. "They don't want dry police reports about unsolved cases. They want stories." And the stories multiplied. Some claimed they'd seen the village glowing with ghostly light at night. Some swore they'd heard voices in the wind, calling out in Inuktitut. Adventurers began traveling to Lake Anjikuni in search of answers and came back either empty-handed or with new frightening tales. But there were those who tried a rational approach. Dr. Henry Wilson, an anthropologist from McGill University, visited the lake in the summer of 1937. He spent a month there conducting archaeological digs around the abandoned village, taking soil samples, studying the remains. His report was dry and academic. There is no evidence of paranormal phenomena. The village was abandoned under unclear circumstances. But that does not imply supernatural intervention. The most likely explanation is mass poisoning, possibly from contaminated food or water, causing delirium and disorientation. The villagers may have wandered into the tundra and perished. Their bodies could have been scavenged by wildlife or buried under snow and ice. It was a reasonable scientific theory, but it didn't explain why not a single body had ever been found. Didn't explain why the dogs remained tied up. Didn't explain the complete absence of tracks. Another theory came from geologist Robert Henderson in 1939. Perhaps a geological anomaly, a sudden sinkhole, had swallowed the village and its people. But surveys showed the land around the lake was stable. No signs of recent collapses. Climatologist James Sterling suggested a sudden storm had struck, forcing the villagers into the tundra where they became lost and died. But weather records for November 1930 showed no such storm. And again, why would people go into a storm without weapons, without warm clothing, leaving food and dogs behind? Every theory made sense on paper, and every theory collapsed under the weight of the facts. Padlack, the guide who had accompanied McCrae to the lake, died in 1940. Before his death, he called for a young missionary, Father Martin, and asked him to write down his story. "I was there," the dying man said. "I saw the empty village. I felt what was there. It wasn't evil, you understand? It was something else. Something ancient. Something that was here before us, and will be here after us." He paused, breathing with difficulty, his wrinkled hand gripping the priest's. "My people know the north is not ours. We live here, we hunt here, we die here. But we do not own this land. The land owns us, and sometimes takes what it wants." "But why?" Father Martin asked. "Why those people?" Padlack smiled weakly. "You ask why of the wind? The sea? The ground? They don't think like people. They have no reasons we can understand." Those were the last words he ever spoke on the subject. He died that night, taking whatever he knew, or believed he knew, with him. Years passed. The Second World War came and went. The world changed. Technology leapt forward. The Arctic grew less mysterious, planes flew over it regularly. Radar scanned its wastes, military bases took root in the north. But Lake Anjikuni remained untouched. The village, or what little was left of it, slowly decayed under the weight of time and weather. The igloos caved in. Snow buried the last traces of human life. 20 years after the disappearance, almost nothing remained. Just a few melted snow mounds only inexperienced I could recognize as former homes. Joe LaBelle died in 1952 in a Winnipeg nursing home, far from the north. Until his last days he dreamed of Lake Anjikuni. The smoke above the igloos, the silence. Nurses said he sometimes woke up screaming, but when asked what he had seen, he only shook his head and turned toward the wall. Sergeant McRae lived to 70, retired with honors, wrote memoirs about his years in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He devoted only one short paragraph to Lake Anjikuni. Of all the cases I investigated in 30 years of service, only one remains completely unresolved. It has haunted me all my life, not because I couldn't find an answer, but because I feared the answer lay outside anything I was prepared to accept. He never elaborated. At veteran gatherings, when asked about it, he politely changed the subject. By the 1960s, the story of Lake Anjikuni had become folklore, one of those half-believed, half-dismissed tales. Tour guides told it to visitors. Paranormal authors wrote books about it. Cheap documentaries dramatized it. The real story, the story of 30 real people with names, lives, hopes, fears, was buried somewhere under layers of myth and sensationalism. Inuit elders still pass the tale to younger generations, but now as a warning, a lesson. There are places you shouldn't go, they said. There are questions you shouldn't try to answer. Modern researchers armed with new technology tried to solve the mystery. In 1976, a team of archaeologists from the University of Toronto held an excavation at the site. They found artifacts, clothing fragments, tools, animal bones. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the village had indeed been inhabited until the early 1930s. But no human remains were found. This is unusual, wrote expedition leader Dr. Peter Davidson, but not unprecedented. The Arctic is vast. If the villagers left and died somewhere in the tundra, their remains could be scattered across hundreds of kilometers. Searching for them under such conditions is nearly impossible. It was a rational explanation, but it didn't quiet the unease felt by those who stood on the shores of Lake Anjikuni in the silence of the Arctic night, feeling what LaBelle had felt nearly half a century earlier. Because places remember. The earth remembers, and some places keep their secrets so tightly that no science, no technology, can ever pry them loose. Lake Anjikuni still exists today. On satellite images it looks ordinary, a gray smudge among the brown and white of the northern landscape, no different from the thousands of other lakes scattered across the Arctic. The local Inuit still avoid the place. If you ask an elder who knows the old traditions, he will answer briefly, "Bad place. Don't go there." Why? He'll shrug. Maybe he'll tell the story of the disappearance, maybe he won't. But in his eyes you'll see the same thing LaBelle once saw in Kakertak's eyes almost a century ago. An ancient understanding. A quiet knowledge that the North keeps secrets that aren't meant to be uncovered. The official RCMP report exists. McRae's notes exist. The testimonies of LaBelle, O'Connor, Padlack. All of it was documented by practical, grounded men accustomed to the harsh realities of the North. And all of them said the same thing. Something happened at Lake Anjikuni. Something they could not explain. 30 people vanished at Lake Anjikuni in November 1930. That much is fact. Where they went, that is the mystery. And maybe it's a mystery that will never be solved. Maybe that's for the best. Some mysteries aren't meant to be unraveled. They exist to remind us of the limits of our understanding. To remind us that beyond the edges of the map there are always white spaces. Places that both attract and frighten us. If you ever find yourself in the North, if you hear the name Lake Anjikuni from the locals, if someone offers to take you there, decide for yourself. Maybe you'll see nothing but a cold lake and empty tundra. Maybe you'll feel the same inexplicable chill LaBelle felt, the one that had nothing to do with the temperature. There are modern travelers who have camped on the lake's shore. Some say they heard voices on the wind. Some woke with the feeling that someone had been standing beside their tent, watching. Some saw strange lights hovering above the frozen water. How much of that is real, and how much is imagination? No one can say. The human mind loves to fill the darkness with ghosts. But sometimes, very rarely, the ghosts are real. Lake Anjikuni lies in silence. just as it did 90 years ago, just as it will for centuries to come. The ice forms in winter, melts in summer. The northern lights dance across the sky in green and violet waves. And somewhere beneath that ice, or deep in the tundra, or in a place we cannot imagine, perhaps the answer still exists. Perhaps Angwingwak and his family, little Sedna, young Nanak, all those 30 people, know what happened on that November night, but they cannot tell us, or will not, or are not allowed. And the lake keeps their secret, just as it keeps the cold, just as it keeps the silence. Because the north is not ours. We are only guests here, temporary, fragile, mortal. When the wind howls over the frozen water, when the Arctic night settles across the tundra, you can almost hear them, the voices that left and never returned. Lake Anjikuni waits, in the silence, in the cold, and its mystery remains unsolved.